need a glass of water.
I've got a bottle of water here.
And then, yeah, let me put the lights to the right.
Okay.
So you need to, just now upstairs. That people be able to see.
Okay.
Can you see? Okay.
Yeah. Well, hello everyone. I'm very happy to be here. I've come a long way from Brisbane, Australia, though you wouldn't know that from my un-Australian accent. Before I get started, I wanted to thank Pam Thirschwell and the University of Sussex's Centre for Modernist Studies for both conceptualizing and hosting this event. I'm sure you all agree with me that there's no better location to think and talk about quadrophenia than Brighton. Not only is it a key site for the movie, but I always think of it as Maud's spiritual home as well. I also want to thank Richard Barrett for making these slides look so beautiful, as you'll see through the next few minutes of my talk. So clearly, I have a very long, unwieldy, and academic title for my talk. I'm here today to speak about how the film Quadrophenia served as a crucial catalyst for Maud revivals outside of Britain. While the British revival was already underway prior to the film's release, my research on the international reach of Maud culture has shown that the film, more so than the bands at the time like The Jam or The Secret Affair, influenced young people around the globe to embrace this way of life. So in case you're wondering about this photo, which I thought was very appropriate to start off with, this was taken inside a shop in Tokyo called, of course, Sexy Underground London, because that's what you do in Tokyo, where many Maud-themed products were sold, and clearly it was very important for the store's designer to include Jimmy in the decor. So this was on one of the walls in the shop. So what I'm going to do now is take you on a bit of a tour around the world and show you, via interviews and historical or archival research that I've conducted, and this was done mainly between 2004 and 2007, examples of Quadrophenia's influence on those young people outside of Britain who would become Mauds from 1979 onwards. So the book that I wrote that came out in 2009, which is appropriately called We Are the Mauds, a transnational history of a youth subculture, I do talk about Maud from its inception in England in the early 60s, and I do address that issue about the Beatles, in fact. I won't be talking about that so much today. Really, I'm going to be talking about what happened because of Frank Rodham's film. So although this phenomenon can be traced to many countries around the world, my work has specifically focused on the US, Germany, and Japan, so that's where most of these narratives will be coming from. I do really want to highlight this period of 1979 to 1984 because it best illustrates the direct impact of the film on non-UK audiences. However, I will round things out with a few comments about Quadrophenia's lingering influence among contemporary Mauds worldwide. Our first stop, yes, is to that rather strange English-speaking country across the Atlantic where I come from, the United States. And before speaking to how some young people reacted to the film, it's very interesting to note how some prominent film critics received the film. While both the New York Times' Janet Maslin and Los Angeles Times' Robert Hilburn both agreed that the film was a riveting and intriguing one, these critics were concerned that the quintessentially British film would somehow get lost in translation. So here's obviously an excerpt from Maslin's review. She writes, "Quadrophenia, which opens today at the Paramount and other theaters, is set in England in 1964 and populated with mods and rockers, warring bands of teenagers who speak with such thick accents that American audiences may find their conversation indecipherable. For this and other reasons, the film, which is a hit in England, hasn't traveled well. I'm sorry, Janet Maslin, but you were wrong. She really turned out to be quite wrong, because Quadrophenia took off on cult movie circuits and achieved this cult movie status rather quickly between 1979 and 1980, with repeat screenings at art house and university-affiliated theaters. So if you might indulge me for just one moment, I remember my first screening of Quadrophenia in 1981 at the now-defunct Varsity Theater near Northwestern University outside of Chicago, my hometown. So I was not even 10 at the time, and my teenage sister, who was not a mod, but a fan of The Who and all things 60s, snuck me in. She was babysitting and just decided she wanted to see the double feature of The Kids Are All Right and Quadrophenia, and took me in. I have to say I'm pretty certain it wasn't just the first time I'd seen mods on film, but the first time I'd also seen people snogging and shagging on film as well. So as you can imagine, it was a pretty memorable cinema experience for me as a 10-year-old. The other key memory of the screening is of a substantial queue of people vying to get into the theater. Like my 15-year-old sister, many younger Who fans and non-mainstream youth, including many punks, gravitated towards the film. A 1981 Los Angeles Times article documented this phenomenon. According to one teenager interviewed for this particular article, Quadrophenia's message was relevant to her subcultural identity. In her words, quote, "It was sort of about our lives, the lives in the film. Those kids were kind of like punk." You have to put the like in there because this is Southern California. All right, so most importantly for our discussion here, some young Americans not only loved the film, but became mods as a result of its influence. There are several articles in both the Los Angeles Times and the New York Times, but this one is from the Los Angeles Times, that documented this phenomenon in both LA and San Diego. As early as December 1979, one reporter states, quote, "No one is exactly sure what triggered the new mod revival. No doubt The Who's film Quadrophenia has played a major role in reviving the sound and fury of the era." This article from 1982 really underscores the cultural power of the film. As this quote says, "John Irvin was 14 when he saw the movie that would change his life. The movie was Quadrophenia. It's a look at a group of mid-60s British youths who call themselves mods and dressed fashionably in reaction to motley'r youths." The article's writer goes on to state that what Irvin and thousands of other upper-middle-class youth saw in Quadrophenia that led them to become mods remains a mystery, but it certainly had something to do with style, with class. Now Irvin has seen the movie more than 200 times, and mod style figures in everything he does. In another 1982 article, this time documenting the San Diego scene, the reporter shares, quote, "Mods began appearing on the music scene in 1980, but it wasn't until a year later, however, that the local mod scene really began to develop. The catalyst was the San Diego premiere of Quadrophenia." What I want to call the Quadrophenia effect was also evident in West Germany. This photo captures the Hamburg mod scene circa 1980, but there were also very strong parallel scenes emerging in Düsseldorf and Munich at the time. As compared to the US, a closer geographic proximity to the UK allowed for some Germans to gain insights into mod culture earlier on, either through travel to England, touring mod revival bands, or word of mouth. Quadrophenia nonetheless still played an essential role for many of those in Hamburg and elsewhere who became mods in the late 70s and especially by the early 80s. According to longtime Munich-based mod Harry Vogel, who was born in 1963, He says, it was either 1978 or 1979, around the time that Quadrophenia was playing at the cinema, that I heard the word mod for the first time, and that's exactly what I thought it meant to me, parkas and fights on the beach and The Who. Though he had already bought a Jam LP a year or so earlier and thought the band looked and sounded great, he didn't realize immediately that they identified as mod. In Harry's case, Quadrophenia was the missing puzzle piece that connected everything together. More dramatically, another longtime mod named Yanni Daibel shared with me how Quadrophenia played a major role in her discovery of mod culture in her hometown of Hamburg. As she recalls it, quote, "That was in 1980 when I first heard about mod, and of course everything was in connection to the film Quadrophenia. I didn't read anything about it, but I heard about it, and the first time when I went on the Hamburg Underground and saw several mods, I asked them, 'Well, who are you?' because they looked different, and they were quite loud. They were shouting, 'We are the mods.' So I thought, oh yeah, okay, they must be mods, whatever that is." Yanni then followed them to a favorite cafe and soon was well on her way to discovering all things mod. By the time this special Hamburg issue of Stern magazine was published in 1984, Yanni was considered the first lady of the city's mod scene. She would go on to sing in various mod and 60s-inspired bands, DJ under the moniker Dr. Mod while completing her PhD, and eventually would write a book entitled March of the Mods, which was published last year. So continuing on with our tour, our next stop is Japan. Quadrophenia was released there under the somewhat off-putting title, The Pain of Living. I love Japan. Nonetheless, it attracted young audiences, some of whom would be spurred on to embrace mod culture as well. Here is but one example I was given about Quadrophenia's impact. According to Kotaro Futura, who was born in 1970 in Tokyo, he's a longtime mod enthusiast and owner of Jungle Scooters, a Vespa and Lambretta dealership in Tokyo. Both Quadrophenia and scooters overall played crucial roles in establishing Tokyo's mod scene from the late 1970s onward. He describes how in 1979, after a midnight viewing of Quadrophenia in the city's Shinjuku district, two teenagers decided they were going to be mods. Soon after, each of them thought they must be the only mod in Tokyo, if not Japan. But one day, they crossed paths while on their Vespas, suddenly realizing the possibility of many others interested in the mod lifestyle. Futura identified these two young men and mods as the future guitarist of Tokyo band The Collectors, Kotaro Furuuchi, and the other as Manabu or Mabo Kuroda, future member of another mod-inspired Tokyo band, I Spy. Like the revered Paul Weller, Kuroda is known in Japan's mod circles today as the country's own mod father. So, though my original round of research that went into my book did not include Australia, I was recently very lucky to look through the Kirsten Sibley Mod Archive at Sydney's Powerhouse Museum. This photo is of Kirsten's high school diary, which is filled with a fascinating, and I will say an underscore fascinating, mix of assignment due dates and engagements that really mattered to her, such as when she would next see Quadrophenia. One entry dated the 17th of September 1983 proudly states that this would be her 7th viewing of the film. While this particular diary is from 1983, there was also one available from 1982, the previous year, and I did have a chance to look at that as well. It had similar attention paid to the film, including many magazine cutouts of Toya Wilcox pasted in its pages. The film was released in Australia mid-1980, and when the press started chronicling the subsequent mod scene there, quadrophenia was once again mentioned quite liberally. To quote a National Times piece from February 1982, quote, "Quadrophenia helped the movement snowball." So in moving past the early 1980s, it's important to know that many of these non-British teenagers who discovered mod culture through quadrophenia between 1979 and 1984 are still mods today. This fact, as well as quadrophenia's continued influence on new generation of mods, has contributed to the growth of what I call a mod diaspora, which is the title of my talk as well. So in the United States, mods are still most visible in both Southern and Northern California. So here are some images of Bay Area musician Bart Davenport, who I think actually still regularly tours through England and Europe. The photo on the left is from the late 1980s, while the image on the right is the cover of an album by the Loved Ones, the mod band that Bart helped to found in the early 1990s. Small scenes continue to exist in San Francisco, LA, Chicago, and New York, but in my opinion, with the research I've done, the scenes there are not nearly as robust as, say, either the contemporary German or Japanese mod scenes. So, speaking of Germany, Germany does have an incredibly healthy mod scene today, with many weekenders in the Rhineland, Hamburg, and Berlin, which often draw participants from across Europe and the UK too. This photo is one I took at the Men from Uncle Weekender in Bad Breisig near Cologne in 2008, and it's been going on for over 15 years now. And I do really wish I had it to show you today, but a bunch of German mods, in fact, posed for a photo that is an homage to this Quadrophenia poster that you see here. So clearly the film still has a lot of symbolic currency among the German mods today. This is quite a fascinating legacy that I'm about to share with you. In Japan, and it's a very curious one in many ways, but alongside the many Japanese mods who have this over-the-top obsession with scooters, many male mods there, when adopting an English pseudonym, will call themselves Jimmy. I'm not kidding. I think I met about 10 Jimmys just in Tokyo, and that's one of them there on the left. Probably the first Jimmy that I met when I was in Japan. So much of what I've talked about today is part of the research, like I said, that went into my book on mod culture, which came out with Peter Lang in 2009. And, you know, sorry, I am American, so I will have a shameless plug here for you. But if you're interested in more details and looking at sort of the spread of the history of mod, not just across time, but across geographic and cultural space, my book should be available here at the pop-up shop, but if not, it is on Amazon.uk as well. So some mods have been critical of it, because, especially British mods, because I do say that the way mod manifests in various countries is quite different. So for instance, the Beatles were considered mod in the 60s in the US, and they were ambassadors for all things hip, trendy, and British at the time. So there you go. But Fabio in Italy seems to think the book is quite nice, and he's been a mod for quite a long time. In fact, I think he's about 50 now. So he was one of these mod revival mods that I've been talking about. To close, I would just really like to thank The Who, Frank Rodham, and all those responsible for creating Quadrophenia. The film has truly served as a kind of media ambassador of mod across the globe. It's allowed young people the world over to have exposure to mod culture and embrace an identity they felt was theirs too. Undoubtedly, it has created a mod community that has moved well beyond Brighton and well beyond Britain's shores. Thanks so much.
Suzanne Coker, What to Run. Okay. Little bit of a technical note before I get started. I'm focusing on the album, not the film, and specifically on lyrics. So I'm going to be quoting a little bit. And I'm going to quote from more than one album, as the title implies. So I needed a way to let you know, first of all, when I'm quoting, and second of all, what I'm quoting. Well, the backup tapes weren't working out, okay? I couldn't get in time with the backing track, so we went to low-tech option B. Does it make sense to everyone? Okay, can they be seen? Okay. It is great to be here helping put the mod back in modernist. And Christine mentioned a couple of cities in the States where mod is a big thing. New York, Chicago, San Francisco, Los Angeles. If you tried to find a place in the States that was equally distant and as far as you could possibly get from all of those cities, that would be my home. So add to that the fact that the movie didn't even come out until I was well late into my teens. My first experience of mods was listening to a borrowed copy of The Who's album. And I got to admit, I was baffled. Not only were the mod details unclear at best, I was young enough in my teens that a lot of the emotions of the album just kind of went over my head. I just wasn't ready for it, and it was a little intimidating. So I returned the album. And a few years later, though, I heard it again. This time it registered, and it registered in a big, dramatic, soul-shaking kind of way. Although I'm pretty sure I still didn't get the mod part quite right, and I'll be honest, I probably still don't, but by the end of this conference, But I'm not real sure that's important. I don't approach music, especially this band, especially this album, solely as a cultural artifact. I know that's part of what it is. I know rock isn't always art. It isn't always to be trusted. And even art isn't effortless, isn't always sincere, and doesn't happen in a vacuum. But when I listen, what I hear, what I still feel is a cry from the heart, resonant and answered. The album serves as a soundtrack for crisis, that difficult shuffling of identity that defines adolescence but can recur at any time. And one thing I do know about mods is they understood identity as a form of art. Rock at its best is also art. And I think we might all agree Quadrophenia is some of the best rock out there. We could argue that, but I don't think at this conference. Like other works of art, Quadrophenia is at once document and passion. It both stands alone and benefits from comparison. Fortunately, there are a few albums worthy to compare with it. Not many, just a few. For listeners from the States, one in particular springs to mind. Born to Run is as American as Quadrophenia is British. The albums are very different in ambition and intent. Born to Run fills quite a different place in Springsteen's career than Quadrophenia does in The Who's. And of course, Born to Run contains no attempt at larger narrative or overarching theme. It's much shorter, 8 tracks to Quadrophenia's 17. It's no rock opera, just a good rock album. A collection of standalone songs that ultimately work together and become more. Differences aside, that's where the two albums stand in common. Details that resonate and convey something beyond themselves. Each album paints a portrait of restless youth at a particular time and place. What Quadrophenia does for mods of the 1960s, Born to Run does for the anonymous denizens of backstreet New Jersey in the 1970s. The anti-heroes of both belong to the universal tribe of teenager and the larger one of us all. Comparison of these worlds and how they're depicted yields insight into each, and ultimately into the dark hearts of adolescence and crisis. Both worlds are filled with conflict, loneliness, love, and the tension between cynicism and hope. Both require dealings with universal aspects of identity and community, work, cultural expectations, authority. Both worlds are boys' clubs, filled with things that fascinate very young men, and if they're honest, older ones too. Whether it's a GS scooter or something, a GS scooter, or something Hemi-powered. Boys in both worlds seem to understand faith in your machine. There's also fashion and girls, which seem to hold very different places in each world. Concern with fashion famously pervades Quadrophenia, while in Born to Run it's only mentioned twice and never described in detail, relegated to visionaries who dress in the latest rage in Jungle Land and use to court success in meeting across the river. Change your shirt, because tonight we've got style. Girls in Quadrophenia are pretty much objects. The only power they seem to have is as arbiters of fashion. While they may be beautiful and desired, it's from a distance, with spurned cynicism flavoring even the most wistful longing. I see her dance across the ballroom, UV lights making starshine of her smile. There's talk of rape and deflowering. Ultimately, girls are not even objects of desire, but targets of rage. The girls in Born to Run have some rage of their own, as well as a range of other emotions and a fair amount of power. There's the barefoot girl who presumably murders her lover in Jungle Land, and the nearly terrifying heroine of She's the One. That terror and her power comes from inescapable desire. No matter where you sleep tonight or how far you run, she's the one. Less threatening girls are even named, if somewhat generically, Mary, Wendy. They're coaxed and pleaded with and promised lasting love, desired not just as objects, but as partners in a new life. So Mary, climb in. It's a town full of losers. I'm pulling out of here to win. That hope of a new life also distinguishes the two worlds. The action of both albums takes place in a sort of grim, shabby underworld where everything falls apart in the very act of blooming. Quadrophenia's primary response is fight. Born to Run's is flight. In Springsteen's world, there's always the option of just hauling ass out of town. There's also the knowledge implicit in the title phrase and certain beneath the optimism that escape is an illusion. You can fly all right, there's nowhere to land. Curiously, it's in Quadrophenia that travel liberates, in the triumphant pilgrimage of drowned. The closest equivalent on Born to Run is the title track's depiction of Saturday night cruising, but beneath that thrill is a sense of closed-in, repetitive horror. The highway's jammed with broken heroes on a last-chance power drive. Everybody's out on the run tonight. There's no place left to hide. Fighting happens in both albums, but it holds a very different place and employs different styles. Violence in Quadrophenia is mostly unarmed riots and fistfights. In Born to Run, it's switchblades and guns. In Quadrophenia, violence happens in groups, often very large ones, and seems to be almost a form of entertainment. It's something you build yourself up to and reminisce about after it's done, a sort of release from the tensions of daily living. But violence in Born to Run is pervasive and not exceptional, and at its most pure and decisive, it's deeply personal. Not resolution, but source of daily tension, it goes hand in hand with loneliness. In the tunnels uptown, the rat's own dream guns him down. Shots echo down them hallways in the night. No one watches as the ambulance pulls away, or as the girl shuts out the bedroom light. Loneliness in Quadrophenia seems to come from being misunderstood, not fitting in, not even really being seen. Loneliness in Born to Run, like violence, is pervasive and almost taken for granted. Symbolized by night and darkness, it shows up in every song. Every song is a nearly desperate attempt to reach out to other characters, to the listener. In Quadrophenia, loneliness is social and at least theoretically curable. In Born to Run, it's existential. In both albums, love and friendship are considered as solutions to loneliness. Love in Born to Run is mostly the relatively straightforward type of most pop songs. Guy and girl together against the world, gaining strength from each other, effective in direct proportion to their unswerving intensity. The song Backstreets is, among other things, a sort of meditation on friendship, keenly felt, fondly remembered, but ultimately betrayed when the breakdown hit at midnight, apparently both a specific event and an effect of growing up. Until then, however, the song's narrator finds in his friend Terry a companion true and vital as any romantic partner. In fact, the name and the lyrics could be read either way. Although we know he's a dude, Terry could easily be female, the friendship also a romance. This sort of intense personal binding friendship doesn't seem to exist in Quadrophenia's world, where Jimmy's peers are more competitors than companions, and a source of much stress. I work myself to death just to fit in. Disillusion with his peers and with romantic love are at the heart of Jimmy's dilemma. But one thing that establishes Quadrophenia as the greater album is the way love comes to mean something else in the end. There's no equivalent on Born to Run for Love Reign O'er Me, in function, presentation, or meaning. The universal spiritual love referenced here is the ultimate answer to loneliness, social or existential, and Springsteen's characters never even imagine, much less cry out for it. Disillusion springs from and reveals the tension between cynicism and hope. Jimmy's disillusion is total and dramatic. It makes an impact, then begins to resolve, forged into the desperate, furious hope of the album's finale. Disillusion in Born to Run is more like that album's violence, pervasive, unsettling, never resolved. Springsteen's anti-heroes aren't disillusioned by their own subculture. It's never trustworthy or consistent enough to inspire with that much faith to begin with. Whatever world of their own they have is fugitive, fleeting. It scatters and reforms and scatters again at the edges of a larger world, holding together only until the local cops, cherry tops, rips this holy night. The real disillusion in Born to Run is with that larger world, best summed up in the title song by the phrase, "Runaway American Dream." Runaway in two senses. It dangles always just out of reach, forcing believers to keep running after it. And it's out of control. In both albums, struggle with the larger world is played out through interactions with work, older rebels, and authority. Jimmy's encounters with the dirty jobs, and with his former hero turned bellboy, lead to rage and scorn, some of which turns against himself and contributes to despair and ultimately resolution. In Born to Run, work is briefly alluded to at the beginning of the title track and features in only one other song where it's a necessary evil, best forgotten when not there. You work 9 to 5 and somehow you survive until the night. Both albums display a sort of angry pity for some aspects of their larger cultures. In Quadrophenia, this shows up in Helpless Dancer and in the Country Always Starved of Is It in My Head. In Born to Run, it's stated most clearly in Backstreets. At night, sometimes it seemed you could hear the whole damn city crying. This angry pity influences the characters' confrontations with cultural expectations, what they're supposed to be and achieve. For Jimmy, these expectations are relatively clear and modest. Get a job and fight to keep it. But the nastiness and hypocrisy of that fight put it out of reach. To do what's expected, he'd have to give up what's good inside him. And despite all the self-loathing, there is something. Unspokenly, he knows this and values it, although it only makes him angrier. For Springsteen's characters, expectations are more vague and grandiose. Earnest efforts to live up to them cause little but trouble and pain. They begin trying in vain to breathe the fire we was born in, learn how to walk like the heroes we thought we had to be. But come to find out we're just like all the rest, stranded in the park and forced to confess. The attempt to forge a true identity is never easy. In either world, it leads to struggle. Those who've already lived out this struggle, question their given roles, whatever the result, are especially interesting and threatening to adolescents. In Quadrophenia, older rebels are confronted directly in The Punk and the Godfather with a kind of openly accusing exchange it's hard to imagine surviving in Springsteen's world. The punks of Meeting Across the River rightly fear the tougher criminals they're trying to impress. But The Punk and the Godfather takes place in the context of the music business, so the better comparison might be with 10th Avenue Freeze-Out. I'm going to sit right back easy and laugh when Scooter and the big man bust this city in half. The characters here, of course, are Springsteen and Clarence Clemens themselves, and it's hard to imagine that kind of boastful confidence from either the fictional punk or Godfather. Older rebels may have authority, but they haven't quite become the authorities. For most adolescents, authority is primarily represented by parents. Each album's attitude toward authority is perhaps best summed up by how parents are described. Jimmy's parents are a key element of Quadrophenia. He fights with them at first half-heartedly because he has to in order to fit in, though his affection for them gets in the way. It's only after they throw him out that he turns them into villains. But parents make no appearance at all in Born to Run. They aren't even mentioned unless you count in the deep heart of the night they set us loose of everything. Authority in this world is represented more truly by the police, a force not to be trusted or confronted, only outwitted and evaded where it can't be ignored. Their inhabitants confront universal problems, but these albums portray very different worlds. Quadrophenia is full of grand-scale violence and rage whose consequences are mostly internal and ultimately lead to redemption. The major symbol is water, vital and destructive, cleansing and threatening. It pervades and ultimately uplifts. The world of Born to Run is one of casual darkness, where unpredictable violence and corrosive cynicism lurk beneath and power a glowing dream. There's no plot, therefore no resolution. Redemption is promised, hoped for, but never really arrives. The major symbol is night, a zone of both escape and threat. Both albums are drenched in great emotion. Each causes a sort of useful injury. Quadrophenia is blunt trauma. Overwhelmed by sheer volume, power, and enormous grandeur on all fronts, the listener submits and learns. Born to Run is knife work. Quick, focused, honed to an edge of absolute intensity, it strikes and is done by the time you see you're bleeding. Later, tending the wound, you can learn if you like. Born to Run begins with a slammed door in a waving dress. It ends with a howl of soul-deep pain. Quadrophenia begins with waves on the beach and a snarling challenge. It ends with a crash of transcendence. In between, each presents its world in a way that takes both rock and identity into the realm of art.